A small keepsake box has quietly sat on my brother's dresser for 6 long years. I did not know that until fairly recently, and I still find it strange how ordinary that dresser always looked every single time I walked past it. Inside it, folded neatly once, sits a short note our father wrote and signed 4 days before he actually died. My name is Greta Lindqvist. I am 39 years old, and I have spent nearly all of my own entire adult career working as a forensic accountant outside Madison, Wisconsin. For the last 8 full years of our father's life, I drove 2 hours each way, most weeks, without fail, to manage his appointments, his medications, and his slow, difficult decline. My brother Soren visited only rarely, though he always arrived with flowers and some grand gesture, and our whole family called him devoted for it anyway. 6 full years after our father's death, at Soren's own anniversary dinner for our parents, I overheard him on the phone, mentioning a note he had never once given to me. Let me take you back now to where this whole thing actually started. Before I go back any further, if stories like this one genuinely matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps a small channel like mine reach the exact people who need to hear a story like this one most. And tell me in the comments, honestly, whether your own family ever rewarded the sibling who showed up occasionally with more warmth and attention than the one who quietly never actually left. I read every single one of them, usually the same night I post a new story. All right, let's go back now to a modest house in Madison, Wisconsin, where two very different children grew up under the same quiet, ordinary roof. My brother Soren is 3 years older than me, and growing up, he was always the one with the bigger, louder personality. He could talk our father into almost anything, with enough charm and enough certainty in his voice, and our parents adored that particular quality in him, openly, the way parents often adore the child who fills a room without trying. I was quieter, more careful, the one who actually noticed when something needed fixing before anyone else mentioned it. We loved each other, genuinely, in the specific way siblings do, when one of you performs the caring loudly, and the other one simply does it. I remember a specific afternoon, when I was maybe 10 years old. That tells you almost everything about how our house actually worked. Soren had forgotten our mother's birthday entirely that year, and showed up 2 days late with an enormous bouquet and an elaborate apology, delivered in front of the entire extended family at Sunday dinner. Our mother cried happily and told everyone how thoughtful he was, underneath all that forgetfulness. I had spent that same week quietly organizing her recipe cards into a new binder, unprompted, and nobody at that dinner mentioned it at all. I did not resent that moment, not exactly, not as a child. I understood, even then, that Soren's gestures were simply louder than mine, easier to notice, easier to praise out loud at a crowded table. What I did not understand yet, and would not understand for another 3 decades, was that our family had built an entire private economy around noticing the loud thing and quietly forgetting to notice the steady one. I remember another afternoon from that same general period, smaller, though it has stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Our father asked, at dinner one evening, who had remembered to renew the car's registration before it expired, and our mother answered without looking up from her plate that I had, the week before, without being asked. Soren, sitting across the table, made a joke about how I liked being useful, and everyone laughed, including me, though I remember a small, specific sting underneath the laughter that I could not yet name. I think, looking back, that moment was an early version of something Soren would say again, decades later, in a much less gentle tone. I went into accounting in college, methodically, the way I approach most things. By my early 30s, I had built a career I genuinely loved, tracing exactly where money goes, when a family business's numbers stop making honest sense. I chose the specific specialty of forensic work because it rewarded exactly the qualities that had always come naturally to me: patience, precision, and a willingness to notice small details everyone else in a room had already stopped looking for. Soren teased me about it sometimes, calling me the family's designated worrier. He said I apparently could not simply trust a good year without immediately checking the fine print underneath it. I laughed along, most of the time, because the teasing came from real affection, at least back then, before the actual caregiving between us made the joke considerably less funny. I dated a steady, patient man named Nathan for almost 4 years during that stretch. I never quite managed to explain to him why a certain kind of praise, the loud, public kind, made me flinch slightly, rather than glow the way it seemed to for everyone else. He asked me once, gently, after watching a coworker receive an enthusiastic ovation at his own retirement party, why I looked away rather than joining the applause. I told him some version of the truth, that I had simply never trusted a room's applause to mean very much. He held my hand a little tighter for the rest of that evening, without needing the rest of it explained. We ended things eventually, amicably, for reasons that had little to do with my family directly. I have wondered since whether I kept some part of myself guarded in that relationship, without ever quite meaning to. Nathan told me, near the end, that he sometimes felt he was dating someone who did not fully believe she deserved to be noticed, warm in every other way but strangely allergic to being seen. I did not disagree with him. I have thought, more than once since, that Soren's particular shadow reached further into my life than I had ever fully accounted for. Our father, Lars, worked as a machinist for nearly 40 years, and our mother, Elke, managed the household with a kind of quiet, exacting order that I clearly inherited more than Soren did. Lars developed a slow, degenerative condition in his late 60s, the kind that takes a decade rather than a season, and someone in the family needed to manage his growing list of appointments, medications, and small daily crises almost immediately. I lived 40 minutes closer than Soren did, and I offered, without being asked twice, because that is simply what I have always done when a need is clear and nobody else is stepping forward. Lars's diagnosis itself came from a specialist 2 hours away, in Milwaukee. I remember sitting in that waiting room with both of my parents, taking careful notes on my phone, while the doctor explained a prognosis none of us fully understood yet. Soren could not make that particular appointment, citing a work conflict. I remember our mother reassuring him afterward that it was fine, that these things happened, that of course work came first for him, in a way it apparently did not need to for me. I did not say anything in that moment, though I noted, quietly, the specific ease with which an excuse for Soren became reasonable, while a similar excuse from me would have needed considerably more justification. I tested that observation once, deliberately, roughly a year later, mentioning to our mother that I had a demanding audit that same week and might need to skip Lars's Tuesday appointment. She asked, gently but pointedly, whether I could possibly rearrange things, since she worried about him navigating a new specialist alone. I rearranged my schedule, as I always did. I noted, privately, though, that the same accommodation had never once been requested of Soren, under nearly identical circumstances. I want to ask you something before I tell you what those 8 years actually looked like. Have you ever watched a family quietly decide who the reliable one is without ever once discussing it out loud? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think that particular unspoken arrangement happens more often than any of us like to admit, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you what those 8 years actually demanded of me. I drove to my parents' house most Tuesdays and every other weekend, for 8 full years, managing a rotating list of specialists, prescriptions, and small emergencies that never seemed to arrive at a convenient hour. I learned to read Lars's moods within seconds of walking through the door, learned which pharmacy filled which prescription fastest, learned the exact tone of voice that calmed him when his confusion grew worse toward evening. Soren called occasionally, warmly, and visited perhaps 6 times a year, always with a gift, always staying just long enough to charm the room before driving home again. I remember one particular emergency, on a Wednesday afternoon in year 4. Lars fell in the bathroom and could not reach the phone himself, relying instead on a neighbor, who happened to notice his blinds still drawn well past noon. I drove straight there from work, still in my office clothes, and spent the rest of that afternoon in the emergency room, filling out paperwork and answering questions about medications only I seemed to fully know. Soren arrived that evening, after his own workday ended, and our father greeted him warmly, mentioning nothing of the frightening hours that had preceded his arrival, since by then the crisis itself had already quietly passed. Soren brought balloons that evening, oddly enough, having stopped at a shop near the hospital on his way in. Our father laughed with genuine delight at the gesture, calling it exactly the kind of thing that lifted his spirits, unprompted. I stood near the foot of the hospital bed, still holding a folder of discharge paperwork I had spent the last hour completing. I remember feeling, for just a moment, something close to invisible in my own father's recovery room. Our mother, Elke, never once asked me directly how much the driving cost me, in time, in sleep, in the quiet weight it added to every single week, though I do not think she meant any cruelty by that omission. She simply assumed, I came to realize, that my steady presence required no special acknowledgement, the way you do not thank a chair for holding your weight. Soren's occasional visits, by contrast, got discussed for weeks afterward, replayed at every subsequent family gathering, as though showing up rarely made each individual instance shine brighter by comparison. I want to be specific about what those years actually required of me, because it matters to everything that came later. I kept a running spreadsheet, out of professional habit more than anything else, tracking every medication, every dosage change, every specialist's recommendation, so that no single doctor ever had an incomplete picture of Lars's care. I updated it most Tuesdays, sitting at his kitchen table after he had gone to bed. I do not think anyone in my family ever knew that spreadsheet existed, let alone how many quiet hours it actually represented, week after week, year after year. I called Soren occasionally during those years, hoping to share some of the logistics. He always answered warmly, genuinely glad to hear from me. Then he found a polite reason: the actual task at hand could not quite fit his schedule that particular week. I stopped asking directly after the third or fourth time, not out of resentment exactly. I had simply learned that asking cost me something emotionally, that simply doing the task myself did not. Elk mentioned to me once, during that stretch, that she worried Soren felt guilty about not helping more, and asked whether I could reassure him that everything was fine, that I did not mind managing it all myself. I told her, honestly, that I did mind, quietly. I said it gently enough, though, that she did not seem to fully register the answer. I have thought about that exchange many times since, wondering whether I had actually said the true thing plainly enough, or whether I had simply performed the same quiet accommodation I always performed, dressed up as honesty. I remember a specific Christmas, 5 years into Lars's decline, when Soren arrived with an expensive watch for our father. It was an extravagant gesture, one that clearly cost more than I had spent on Lars's care in the entire previous month. Our father wore that watch every single day afterward, proudly, and mentioned Soren's generosity to every visiting nurse and doctor who came through the house. I adjusted Lars's medication schedule that same week, catching a dangerous interaction his previous doctor had missed entirely, and nobody outside the appointment itself ever heard about it at all. I remember driving home from that specific appointment, unusually shaken. The interaction I had caught could genuinely have hospitalized him within days if it had gone unnoticed much longer. I called Soren that same evening, mostly out of habit, to update him on our father's care. I mentioned the medication issue briefly, almost as an afterthought, before he changed the subject to ask whether our mother had liked the watch. I do not think he meant any particular cruelty by that shift in conversation. I simply do not think the two updates registered, in his mind, as remotely comparable in weight. I did not mention that specific comparison to anyone, not that Christmas, not for years afterward. I told myself, the way I have told myself many things, that keeping score was beneath the actual work of caring for someone, that love should not require a running tally to feel legitimate. I believed that explanation for a long time, honestly, right up until I finally heard, in Soren's own voice, exactly how differently our family had been keeping score all along. I want to ask you something before I tell you what Soren actually said to me during those difficult years. Have you ever done the quiet, unglamorous work of caring for someone, while a sibling's rare, dramatic gestures got treated as the real proof of love? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think more people carry that exact specific ache than any of us usually admit, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you what happened the year I finally asked Soren for real help. Lars's condition worsened sharply in year 6, requiring nearly daily oversight rather than my usual twice-weekly visits, and I found myself exhausted in a way I had not fully admitted to anyone, including myself. I called Soren directly, one difficult evening, and asked whether he could take over some of the logistics, even one day a week, simply to give me a stretch of actual rest. Soren told me, not unkindly exactly, but not gently either, that I seemed to genuinely enjoy being the one who managed everything. I had always liked being in control, he said, of the family's problems more than I liked admitting it. I remember the specific silence that followed my own reaction to that sentence, sitting alone in my kitchen, phone still warm against my ear. I told Soren, quietly, that exhaustion and control were not the same thing, and that I would appreciate real help rather than a theory about my personality. He apologized, sort of, in the vague way people apologize when they are not actually planning to change anything. He did take our father to 2 appointments that following month, before quietly drifting back to his usual rare, celebratory visits. I remember, at one of those 2 appointments, our father mentioning to the nurse how nice it was to have his son along, for once. His tone made clear he genuinely enjoyed the novelty of it. I did not resent that comment exactly. I remember noting, privately, though, that 8 years of my own steady presence had apparently never earned quite that same tone of delighted surprise. I told myself, driving home that evening, that novelty and value were different things, and that our father surely knew the difference too, even if he did not always say so out loud. I want you to hold onto that specific phrase, liked being in control, because it comes back to Soren directly, 6 years later, in a very different context entirely. I did not raise the issue again, not directly, for the remaining 2 years of our father's life. I had learned, by then, exactly what pushing further would cost me emotionally, and exactly how little it would actually change in practice. I simply continued, quietly, the way I had always continued. I told myself that our father's remaining time mattered more than winning an argument about fairness with my own brother. Our father died in the spring, 6 years ago now, in the home he had lived in for 30 years, with me beside him and Soren arriving 40 minutes after it was already over. I want to be honest that I did not resent Soren's timing itself. Not really, since some things simply cannot be scheduled around convenience. What I noticed, in the days that followed, was how naturally the family's grief still organized itself around Soren's dramatic arrival and visible emotion, rather than around the 8 quiet years that had actually preceded it. I want to ask you something before I tell you about the funeral itself. Have you ever watched a family's attention gather around the person who arrived last, rather than the person who had been there the entire time? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think that particular imbalance leaves a mark that takes years to fully name, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you about the funeral and the 6 years that followed it. Lars's funeral was small, held at the same modest church our family had attended for decades, filled mostly with old coworkers and a handful of loyal neighbors. Soren gave a moving, tearful eulogy, describing our father's humor and warmth in vivid, specific detail, and several relatives told me afterward how beautifully he had captured Lars's spirit. I said very little at that funeral, standing near the back, the way I generally do at gatherings, and nobody asked me to speak at all. I had, in fact, written something the night before, several pages describing specific memories from those 8 years of Tuesdays, small, ordinary moments I thought our father would want remembered. I kept those pages folded in my coat pocket throughout the entire service, waiting for a natural pause that never quite arrived. Soren's eulogy had already filled the time allotted, and nobody thought to ask if anyone else wished to add something. I drove home that evening with those pages still folded in my pocket, and I do not think I ever fully unfolded them again, though I could not bring myself to throw them away either. I found those same pages, still folded, in a desk drawer while preparing for the birthday gathering 6 years later, and I read them properly for the first time since writing them. They described, in plain, unpolished language, a version of our father. Only someone who had spent 8 years of Tuesdays with him could have actually known it. His specific habit of humming while reading the newspaper. The particular way he thanked me every single visit, even when he could no longer remember my name reliably. I did not read those pages aloud at the birthday gathering either. I brought them with me that evening, though, folded once more in my coat pocket, simply so that some part of that unspoken eulogy could finally be present in the room. Our mother, Elk, thanked Soren extensively in the weeks afterward for his beautiful words at the service. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she supposed I preferred to grieve privately rather than in front of a crowd. I did not correct her, not then, though I remember the specific hollowness of driving home that evening, wondering whether 8 years of Tuesdays had simply evaporated from the family's memory entirely. I want to be honest about something else from that period, because it complicates the story I might otherwise want to tell you. There were nights I genuinely wondered whether Soren was right. Whether I had, in some way, actually enjoyed managing our father's care more than I was willing to admit. Whether my own quiet steadiness was simply a different kind of performance than his loud one. I called a close friend once, describing the whole situation in careful, exhausted detail, needing an outside perspective rather than a family one. My friend listened and told me, gently, that a person who does not need thanks to keep showing up is not the same as a person who does not deserve it. Soren moved into a modest house on our parents' street within a year of Lars's death, close enough that our mother's daily needs shifted naturally onto him by simple geography. I noticed, gradually, that the family narrative shifted alongside that move. Soren became, in every retelling, the son who stayed close and stepped up after our father passed. My own 8 years of driving faded into something rarely mentioned at all, as though caregiving only counted while the person being cared for was still alive to witness it. I noticed this shift most clearly at a cousin's wedding, roughly 2 years after Lars's death. An aunt I had not seen in some time asked Soren how he had adjusted to becoming the primary caretaker for our mother. Soren answered modestly, mentioning a grocery run and a doctor's appointment he had handled that same month, and the aunt praised him warmly for stepping into such an important role. I stood beside them, having personally coordinated Elk's entire medical file transfer to a new physician that same week, a task that took most of a weekend, and neither of them thought to ask me anything at all. I did not correct the record that particular evening, though I remember the specific taste of that silence, sharp and familiar, sitting through the rest of the long reception. I told myself, as I often quietly did in moments exactly like that one, that correcting it publicly would only look petty, that the actual work mattered more than who received credit for it. I believe that particular reasoning was true, mostly. I have also come to understand, though, that believing it did not make the accumulated weight of all those silences any lighter to carry. I did not argue with that shifting narrative, not directly, though I felt its specific unfairness settle somewhere I could not easily dislodge. I continued visiting our mother regularly, on my own schedule, without competing publicly for credit, the way Soren seemed to enjoy doing at every family gathering. I told myself this was simply who I was, someone who did the work quietly, rather than the work of being seen doing it. I want to be honest, though, that the distinction cost me more than I admitted to anyone for a long time. I want to ask you something before I tell you about the anniversary dinner 6 years later. Have you ever watched your own history in a family quietly get rewritten, without a single person actually lying about any individual fact? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think that particular kind of erasure is harder to name than an outright lie, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you about the evening everything actually changed. Our mother planned a dinner 6 years after Lars's death, marking what would have been their 45th wedding anniversary. It was held at Soren's house, with the extended family gathered in his backyard under string lights. I arrived early, the way I arrive at every family event, and helped Elk arrange the folding tables while Soren handled the grill, cheerfully, holding court with cousins who had not seen him in months. I want to describe that evening honestly, because the details matter more than the drama does. I stepped inside Soren's house partway through the evening, looking for a serving spoon in his kitchen. I heard his voice through the cracked door of his home office down the hall, clearly on the phone with his wife, who had stayed home that night with a migraine. He was telling her, in a tone I had never quite heard from him before, that their father's note was still sitting in that same box on his dresser. He kept meaning to give it to me, he said, and kept finding reasons not to. Some part of him worried, he admitted, that it would prove I had somehow been the favorite all along. I stood perfectly still in that hallway, a serving spoon in my hand, listening to my brother describe a note our father had apparently written for me, one I had never once heard existed. I want to be honest about what I felt, standing there. I did not feel triumphant, not in that first moment, and I want to say that plainly. I felt, mostly, a specific, disorienting shock. It was the shock of discovering a 6-year-old secret, sitting in plain sight on a dresser I had walked past a dozen times. I thought, standing there, about every visit I had ever made to Soren's house, every holiday dinner, every casual afternoon dropping off a dish for our mother, all of them happening within a few short steps of that dresser. I thought about the specific irony of my own profession, tracing hidden money for a living. An actual piece of my own family's history had sat quietly undiscovered, in a room I had walked past without ever once suspecting anything. I found myself almost laughing, standing in that hallway, at how thoroughly my training in noticing what does not add up had failed me completely, inside my own family. I heard Soren's voice continue, quieter now, telling his wife that he supposed he would find the right moment eventually, that there was no real rush since our father was not going anywhere different than he already was. I heard him laugh, faintly, at his own dark joke. I remember feeling a flash of something closer to anger than shock. He had treated so casually, a decision that had apparently cost me 6 years without my knowledge. I did not confront Soren immediately, not that night, standing in his hallway with my heart pounding audibly in my own ears. I returned to the backyard instead, found the serving spoon eventually, and finished the evening as though I had heard nothing at all, though I barely tasted a single bite of the meal that followed. I drove home that night with my hands actually shaking slightly on the wheel, replaying his exact words over and over. I wondered how long that note had genuinely been sitting there, and how many Tuesdays I had driven past it without knowing. I want to ask you something, before I tell you what happened once I finally asked Soren directly. Have you ever overheard something never meant for your ears that instantly explained 6 years of a feeling you could not previously name? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think that specific kind of accidental clarity deserves more space than most conversations about family secrets ever give it, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you what happened once I called Soren the following week. I called Soren 3 days later, deliberately calm, and told him plainly that I had overheard part of his phone call at the anniversary dinner. I asked him directly whether our father had actually left something for me. I want to be honest that my voice was steadier than I actually felt asking it. Soren went quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted, haltingly, that our father had given him a short, signed note 4 days before he died. He had asked Soren specifically to pass it along to me once he felt the moment was right. I asked him, gently, why 6 long years had apparently never once produced that specific right moment he kept describing. Soren admitted, after another long pause, that he had been afraid of what the note actually said. He was afraid it would confirm something about our father's true feelings that he did not want confirmed. He told me he had read it once, the week our father died, and had never worked up the nerve to read it again, let alone hand it to the person it was actually written for. I asked him carefully what he actually remembered the note saying, and he admitted he could recall only fragments since he had been too unsettled that first reading to absorb it fully. He remembered it mentioning appointments, he said, and something about Tuesdays. The specific wording had blurred in his memory, over 6 years of deliberately not thinking about it. I asked him why he had never simply reread it, alone, to refresh his own understanding. He admitted, quietly, that rereading it felt like admitting he needed to finally act on what it said. I asked him one more question, carefully, before we ended that particular call, whether our mother knew the note existed at all, or whether that secret had somehow belonged only to the two of them. Soren told me she did not, that our father had given it to him privately, in a quiet, unremarkable moment near the very end, when Elk had simply stepped out of the room for coffee. I asked him why our father had chosen him specifically, rather than simply leaving it somewhere I would eventually find it myself. Soren admitted he had wondered the same thing for 6 years, without ever landing on an answer that made him feel better about the responsibility. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that the note was mine to read and mine to feel whatever it made me feel, regardless of what he was afraid it might say about either of us. Soren apologized, genuinely this time, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from him. He told me he would bring it to our mother's birthday gathering the following month, in front of the family. He thought I deserved to receive it, openly rather than quietly, the way everyone else always seemed to receive their moments. I spent the 3 weeks between that phone call and the birthday gathering in a strange, suspended state, unsure how to feel about a piece of paper I had not yet even seen. I found myself rehearsing, more than once, how I might react in front of the family. I worried that whatever I felt reading it would end up performed for an audience, rather than genuinely private. I mentioned this specific worry to a colleague at work, who told me, kindly, that grief rarely waits politely for the right audience, and that I should simply let myself feel whatever arrived, regardless of who happened to be watching. I want to be honest about what I felt, hanging up that call. I did not feel vindicated, and I want to say that plainly. I know how tempting it might be to want that feeling from a moment like this one. I felt, mostly, a quiet, unsettled grief. Grief for 6 years I had spent assuming our father's true feelings were simply unknowable, when they had, in fact, been sitting in a drawer the entire time. Our mother's birthday arrived 3 weeks later, celebrated at her own house this time. The whole family gathered in the same living room, where Soren had once received that expensive watch on our father's behalf. Soren stood after the cake had been cut and asked for everyone's attention, visibly nervous in a way I had genuinely never seen from him before. He told the assembled family that he had been carrying something for 6 years that belonged to his sister, and that tonight, finally, he intended to give it to her the right way. He handed me the small keepsake box in front of everyone, and I want to describe what happened next honestly, because the details matter more than the drama does. I opened it slowly, aware of every relative watching, and found a single folded note inside, our father's handwriting unmistakable even after all these years. I read it silently first, then, at Soren's quiet urging, I read it aloud to the room. My hands were shaking slightly as I unfolded that single page. It was a physical reaction I do not remember having at any other point in my adult life. I recognized our father's handwriting immediately, the specific slant of his letters. He always crossed his sevens, in the European style he had never fully abandoned after emigrating decades earlier. I noticed, before I had even read a single word, that the paper itself had softened slightly at its creases. It was worn smooth, from 6 long years of being folded and unfolded, by hands other than my own, again and again, in a room I never once suspected. Our father had written that he wanted me to know, plainly, exactly what he had seen over those 8 years of Tuesdays and every other weekend. He wrote that Soren's flowers and grand gestures had always made him smile, genuinely, but that my quiet, unglamorous presence was the thing that had actually kept him steady, appointment after appointment, year after year. He wrote that he had never once mistaken loud love for the deeper kind. He hoped, whenever I finally read this, I would understand he had seen every single Tuesday clearly, even the ones nobody else in the family ever mentioned. He wrote one more thing, near the bottom of that short note, that I have not stopped thinking about since. He asked Soren, by name, to eventually find the courage to say what our father himself never managed to say clearly enough while he was alive. Steady, unglamorous love deserves exactly as much recognition as the loud kind. A family which only celebrates the second sort will eventually exhaust the person providing the first. I want to describe the room in that moment because the details matter more than the drama does. Our mother sat very still, her hand pressed against her mouth. Several cousins would not meet my eyes, and Soren stood beside me, tears visible, waiting until I finished reading before he spoke again. Our Aunt Sigrid, the same relative who had once asked Soren how he had adjusted to primary caretaking, sat frozen near the back of the room, her expression somewhere between recognition and quiet embarrassment. She had, I remembered clearly, praised him warmly at that same wedding, for a role I alone had actually carried for 8 straight, exhausting years, without her once seeming to notice the difference. I noticed her afterward, approaching our mother privately near the kitchen doorway, and I heard fragments of an apology I had not expected, something about not having asked the right questions over the years. I did not join that conversation, though I appreciated, from a distance, that she had at least noticed something worth revisiting. Soren told the room, his voice unsteady, that our father's note had said everything he himself had been too afraid to say for 6 years. He told them that I had driven 2 hours round trip, most weeks, for 8 straight years, while he visited a handful of times annually, and somehow received the family's warmer praise for it. He said he was sorry, plainly, not just for keeping the note, but for every year before that. He had let the family's attention gather around him, without once redirecting it toward where it actually belonged. I want to be honest about what I felt, standing in that living room with that note in my hand. I did not feel triumphant, and I want to say that plainly, a second time, because I think it matters. I felt, mostly, a quiet, complicated relief that our father had truly seen me. There was also a harder grief that it had taken his death, and 6 more years after that, for the rest of the family to see it too. I think about the version of this story where I never stepped into that kitchen looking for a serving spoon. The anniversary dinner ends quietly, and I drive home none the wiser, the way I had driven home from 100 other family gatherings before it. I do not know, in that version, whether the note would have simply stayed on Soren's dresser indefinitely, growing older and more forgotten with each passing year. Perhaps he would have found the courage on his own, eventually, or perhaps he never would have at all. I am grateful, in the most complicated way I know how to be grateful, that I happen to need a serving spoon at exactly the right moment. Here is a question I want to ask you, before I tell you what happened in the months since that birthday. Have you ever discovered, all at once, that someone who could no longer speak for himself had actually understood you completely, the whole time? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think that particular kind of discovery deserves more space than most conversations about grief ever give it, and I read every single one. All right, let me tell you what happened in the months since that birthday. Soren has changed, slowly, in ways I did not fully expect. He calls our mother now on a regular, predictable schedule, every single week, rather than showing up occasionally with gifts. He asks me, genuinely, how the actual logistics of her care are actually managed, day to day, rather than simply assuming they handle themselves. He apologized to me privately again, a few weeks after the birthday, for that specific sentence about liking to be in control. He finally understood. He told me the difference between control and simple exhaustion. He asked me, that same afternoon, whether I would be willing to actually teach him some of the logistics, rather than simply taking them over the way he apparently had assumed I preferred. I spent an entire Saturday walking him through Elk's medication schedule, her specialists, the specific pharmacy that filled prescriptions fastest. I want to be honest that watching him take careful notes felt stranger than I expected, after 8 years of doing it silently and alone. He asked good questions that afternoon, genuinely thoughtful ones, far better than I had ever quietly anticipated he actually would. I found myself, by the end of that long, unhurried afternoon, cautiously hopeful in a way I had genuinely not expected to feel. It was a specific feeling I had not allowed myself to have about my own brother, honestly, in a very long time. Soren has taken our mother to 3 appointments since that Saturday on his own, calling me afterward each time with a brief, accurate summary, the way I once wished he would have done for our father. I do not think he has fully become a different person, and I want to be honest about that too. He still occasionally arrives somewhere with a grand, visible gesture, rather than a quiet, genuinely useful one. He catches himself now, though more often than not, in a way he genuinely never used to before any of this happened. Elk has changed too, in her own smaller, quieter way, though I have noticed it just the same. She called me 2 months ago on an ordinary Tuesday, simply to ask how my week had gone. It was a question she rarely thought to ask directly during all those years of quiet caregiving. I told her about a difficult case at work, and she listened, genuinely. She asked follow-up questions, rather than simply waiting for her turn to mention Soren's latest visit. I do not think she fully understands, even now, exactly how much that particular Tuesday call meant to me, though I have decided that some things are worth appreciating quietly, rather than explaining in full. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I meant it, though I did not pretend 6 years disappeared in a single evening with a note and a birthday cake. Some things take longer to fully settle than one honest conversation can manage, even a necessary one. Our mother has started, gently, correcting the family's old habit of praising only the dramatic gesture. She mentions my name now at gatherings, in a way she rarely did before, small corrections that matter more to me than I initially expected they would. I still keep that note in the same small keepsake box, though it now sits on my own dresser rather than Soren's. I have read it many times since that birthday. I notice something slightly different each time, a phrase I had absorbed too quickly the first time, a specific tenderness in our father's handwriting I had missed while reading it aloud in front of an entire nervous, watching family. I noticed, on my 3rd or 4th reading, a small postscript near the very bottom of the page. I had somehow skimmed past it entirely during that first nervous reading in front of the family. Our father had written that he hoped I would eventually forgive Soren. For the years the note sat waiting. He suspected, even from his own deathbed, that his older son would need more time than his younger daughter to find the necessary courage. I sat with that particular sentence for a long while. I understood, finally, that our father had seen not just my own steadiness clearly, but Soren's specific struggle too. Neither of us had ever quite managed to see that struggle in each other. I called Soren the evening I noticed that postscript, simply to read it to him over the phone, since I thought he deserved to know our father had anticipated his hesitation and forgiven it in advance. Soren was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he thanked me, his voice thick, for calling to share it rather than keeping that particular kindness to myself. I told him I did not see any reason to keep it. Our father clearly meant for both of us, eventually, to understand the whole of what he had written, every single line of it, not just the parts that were easiest to hear. I think, sometimes, about how differently this might have gone. If I had never stepped into that kitchen looking for a serving spoon, Soren might have simply kept avoiding that difficult conversation until the note sat forgotten forever. I am grateful, in a complicated way, that an accident of timing finally forced a truth into the open. It was one that 6 years of quiet grief had never quite managed to surface on its own. Here is what 8 years of quiet caregiving and one small sign note actually taught me, and I want to leave these lessons with you plainly, the way I promised you at the start of this story. A person can spend years assuming their steady, unglamorous care for someone matters less than a sibling's rare, dramatic gestures, simply because a family keeps applauding the louder performance. If you have ever been the quiet one, doing the actual work while someone else received the warmer praise, know this. The person you cared for may have understood the difference far more clearly than anyone around you ever showed. Love measured only by how visible it is will eventually exhaust the person providing the quieter, steadier kind. A family that only celebrates the dramatic gesture teaches its most reliable member that reliability itself is somehow less than love. I spent 8 years wondering whether my own steadiness counted for as much as Soren's flowers. I know now that it did, and I am grateful, in a complicated way, that it took a signed note to finally know it for certain. Being told you like control, when you are actually simply exhausted, is one of the more specific ways a family can misname a person's pain. I have talked with other people since, who described nearly identical moments in their own families. Quiet caregiving mistaken for a personality flaw rather than recognized as the labor it actually was. Every single one told me the same thing, that naming the mistake out loud, even years later, changed something permanently. A sibling can genuinely believe, for years, that showing up rarely and showing up loudly is the same as showing up consistently, and still, eventually, come to understand the difference once the truth finally reaches him directly. Soren did not need 6 years to disappear for his apology to matter to me. I only needed him to finally arrive, at an understanding I had been quietly waiting for the entire time. Sometimes the person who loved you most clearly is the one who can no longer tell you so directly. The truest recognition of your own worth may already exist somewhere, waiting for the right accident to finally bring it into the light. I did not go looking for our father's note. I simply happened to be standing in the right hallway at the right moment, and I have never once taken that particular accident for granted since. I keep that small keepsake box on my dresser now, in plain view rather than hidden away, exactly where anyone visiting could see it without needing to ask what it is. It is a small daily reminder that quiet, steady love is never actually the lesser kind, whatever a family's applause might suggest in any given moment. I have started, since that birthday, keeping a small notebook of my own, nothing formal. I write brief entries after visits with our mother, things she said, small moments I do not want to lose, the way our father's true feelings almost stayed lost. I do not know if anyone will ever read those entries, and I have decided that does not matter as much as I once assumed it would. I write them mostly for myself now, a quiet record of a quiet kind of love, kept simply because keeping it feels right, regardless of who eventually notices. I do not know who will ever read those entries, if anyone ever does at all, and I have decided, finally, that the not knowing does not diminish a single one of them. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a quiet, unglamorous kind of love in your own life, one that deserved more recognition than it ever received. I read every single one, and I answer as many as I can between cases at work, usually in the evening, with that same small keepsake box visible from where I sit. Subscribe if you want another true story like this one. It starts with a woman finding a lease she never signed.